Good afternoon to our Canadian and transatlantic viewers, and good evening to our European and also Middle Eastern Iranian viewers. Wait, okay, sorry, I was thinking so to go. My voice is. Good afternoon to our Canadian and transatlantic viewers, and good evening to our European and also Middle Eastern and Iranian viewers. My name is Parvin Ardalan from the MME team, Migration Memory Encounters. That is a project at Museum of Movement in Sweden. Right now, I'm welcoming you from MOM, or Migration Museum of Movement in Malmö. The event, It's All About the Structures, is a broad thematic to think about the visible and invisible things that act upon us and which we act upon. The overall aim is to create a space for dynamic, interactive, and inclusive talk. You are welcome to send your question after. Our online guest today is Gita Hashemi. Gita originally is from Shiraz, Iran, and now based in Canada. Gita Hashemi is an Iranian-born artist, curator, and writer whose experimental transmedia practice spans over 30 years. Her work centers on marginalized histories and contemporary politics through exploring social relation and the international of language and culture. Two of her most recent projects, Emergent and Dreams Reload, include podcasts that are in free distribution. She is currently working on Archive Iran, Encounters with the Century, a multi-part, multi-platform project that sorry, my voice. Yes. Two of her most recent projects, Emergent and Dreams Reload, include podcasts that are in free distribution. She is currently working on Archive Iran, Encounters with the Century, a multi-part, multi-platform project that foregrounds women's agency in 20th century Iran. And The Woman I Want, an online performance based on the writing of the early 20th century radical feminist, Zandokht Shirazi. Gita's recent art project, Declarations Part 1 and 2, is the series of site-specific performances and interventions performed as a journey from February through April 2016. During the first part of the declarations, the so-called Balkan Route, you passed through 8 countries and 12 cities. Through the route, you connected with people, activists, local artists, and engaged in co-creating art. During the second part of declarations, that is site-specific processor performance and participatory intervention in collaborative with the students of Dar al-Kalima University's Bentelhelm. Through the workshop, the students invited participants to articulate notions of land rights and thereby reclaim their parents' and grandparents' memories toward the land. Welcome to the program, Gita.
Thank you, Parveen. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you, Museum of Movement, for inviting me. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am standing and speaking from the land which is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, my hometown, my adopted town, Toronto, with the original name Toronto, is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work and present from this territory. I would like to speak about a project that is a little older. The project started in 2015, and it was performed in 2 parts. It's titled Declarations. I will speak a little bit about the project, and then I will show some material from about the project. So between 2015 and 2016, I engaged in a 2-part performance project entitled Declarations in order to examine the contemporary conditions in which notions of universality of human rights are contradicted structurally as a matter of daily reality. In the first part, traveling from Canada to Germany through the Balkan and Turkey, I focused on the rights to freedom of movement. The second part took shape in Palestine and focused on the right to land. So I will have to ask you to bear with me. This is my first Zoom presentation, and I am going to try sharing the screen. Sorry, everybody, just bear with me. So I work from the notion that the personal is poetic, the poetic is political, and the political is personal. To me, these 3 dimensions always interconnect in any project that I do. In around 2010, there was an international event which was about the traveling of the Cyrus Cylinder from the British Museum, where a lot of Indigenous artifacts from other places in the world are kept as part of the colonial system. It was loaned back to Iran, and then this artifact, which is about 2,500 years old, or 3,000 years old, traveled to other places, including the US. The Cyrus Cylinder, the mythology about the Cyrus Cylinder is that it is the first document of human rights in the world. And for this cylinder, this particular object, which is a clay cylinder, it's written, it's inscribed in cuneiform in Akkadian, and it describes the relationship between Cyrus and his subjects during after the invasion and victory over Babylon. And the cylinder was buried there at the gate of the city. This is a cornerstone of Iranian identity. We like to think that even though presently human rights are not observed in Iran in great ways, but we are the inventors of the notion of human rights. And so for me, the question was, is that really the case? And what does it mean if we were to think about human rights rather than a document as a declaration, whether it is 3,000 years old or 60 years old, if we were to think about it in terms of practices, and to what extent those practices are indicative of issues of justice, issues of equality. And so the project for me started from here. A kind of memory, if you will, that we Iranians have, even though this memory is really mostly mythology, because the idea of the Cyrus Cylinder being a document of human rights really was propagated during right around, from starting around World War I to around 60s, when Iranian legal scholars and nationalists were looking for a way to safeguard Iranian sovereignty during the invasions and the occupation of Iran by the Allied nations, by the Western nations. And so the idea that Iran is a birthplace of civilization, not only a birthplace of civilization, but the very place where the idea of human rights came into existence, gave a cachet to Iran that made it impossible for, or made it less likely for the Western nations to dominate Iran, and also gave Iran a seat at the table. So when this cylinder, which is now broken, and part of it is broken, when it started circulating, this was during the time when Iran was re-entering the international world as a during Khatami's time, and after, as part of an effort to normalize relations, international relations with Iran. And so the touring of the cylinder created opportunities for what they called the discourse of civilizations, or conversations of civilizations. These are the scholars that came up with the idea of Iranian, that were the delegates of Iran in the first United Nations conference. And this guy might be familiar to you. This is President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was at the time of the cylinder's touring, he was the president of Iran. This is shortly after the famous protests in Iran in 2009 in about the or in objection to the elections that brought Ahmadinejad to power for another round, for another term. So even though he's a staunch Islamist, he of course did not shy away from posing with the cylinder, and not only posing with the cylinder, but really propagating this myth about this cylinder being a first document of human rights that had started in the time of the previous regime, the time of the Pahlavi Shah. Now, this cylinder has an international significance because it was gifted, a replica of it was gifted to the United Nations, and it is now at the entrance of the United Nations headquarters in New York. So of course, as the cylinder was circulating, everybody was taking advantage of the opportunity to pose and take pictures with the cylinder, while in Iran and elsewhere, human rights, practices of human rights actually left much to be desired. Part of this myth, this general myth about Cyrus being a great and just king, was also that he gave permission to the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. And this now, this in a way connects Iranian mythology with Zionist mythology. And both narratives are contested, nevertheless, they're fairly popular. So this is a picture of a street named Kurosh or Cyrus. Kurosh is the Farsi pronunciation of Cyrus. That is in West Jerusalem. So my project started from this idea that I would like to actually look at declaration not as a document, but as a practice. And so how do we declare, how do we practice human rights in our day-to-day? And so when I started my project in 2015, it was at the height of the wave of refugees coming from the Middle East to Europe, particularly from the Middle East, but there were also refugees coming from North Africa and from other parts of Asia. But that was, the focus was at the time on the Middle East, particularly Syrian, Iraqi, Iranian, and Afghani refugees who by far formed the largest majority. So when I started my project, I went to Europe, and rather than focusing on building objects, I decided that I wanted to actually engage with the people who are on the move. Now, I need to explain here that this is a very personal process for me. I'm a refugee from the mid-1980s, and I have experienced the displacement, the wait for getting papers, the going from one place to another and being rejected from one place and then another. And finally rebuilding my life in a new place, and experiencing in the process, experiencing prejudices, experiencing injustices, and all of the things that we now see, all of the issues that we now see being part of the life of refugees. Now that the refugees are center, well, at the time they were center, now they have fallen away from the media. But in 2015, it was all the news you could get, all about the refugees. So I started from Germany, from Berlin, Germany being one of the destination countries for the refugees. Why one of the destination countries? Well, Germany, Northern Europe, and Western Europe are considered to be destination countries because those are the places that have the sufficient social system to support refugees in their new place. But on the way, people have to pass through what is known as the Balkan Route or refugee route. It is one route that goes through, starts from Turkey and goes through some of the Balkan countries to end in Western Europe. So I traveled this route backward. And as I went from country to country and from city to city, I connected with activists and artists who worked in support of the people on the move. And at the same time, I also connected with the people who were on the move. So I visited refugee camps or squats or bus stops. And I worked with grassroots organizations rather than larger aid organizations. And in the process, my idea was that rather than making art objects about refugees, I would like to create opportunities for the refugees to turn the table. Now, we need to remember that, in fact, during most of the 20th century, Europe was one of the largest producers of refugees, of course, during the two world wars and after. during the Balkan Wars. And a lot of these refugees, including during World War II, ended up in the Middle East. Iran was a host to Polish refugees, for example, as was Syria. And so, but our historical memory is pretty short. So we think that the refugee problem, quote unquote, is a problem of the Middle East. But it is really important to remember, in fact, if we want to push it even further back, to say that settlers in North America and settlers in Africa and in Israel, they're all in a way refugees. They're people who go to a new land in search of new opportunities and a new place to live. So my thought was that I would like to show this turn this table and somehow disrupt this relationship that the refugees from the Middle East are guests. And so in every place that I went to, I created opportunities for the people on the move to become hosts, usually over food, and invite the locals. And in that changing of the relationship, create a new opportunity to have a new conversation. During this process, as the project needed to be funded, I also created some artwork that I sent by mail. These are small little cards that I sent by mail from place to place, as from one stop to another, to people who subscribe these and to these artworks, and their subscription helped me fund the project, including the gatherings where the refugees or the people on the move were guests, were hosts. So these are some of those gatherings in Munich, in Berlin, in Novi Sad, in Thessaloniki. And before I move on to the second part of the project, I would like to show you a video.
Can you talk a little bit about your own experience as
the video?
Refugees.
As a refugee?
It was in 2000.
Can you talk a little bit about your own experience as
a refugee?
Can you see the video? Okay. Now?
Can you talk a little bit about your own experience as a
refugee?
As a refugee.
It was in 2001. 2001 in Macedonia was the war between two ethnics, Macedonian and Albanian, and in this time we must leave our country, our homes and our places, and we was refugees in some older cities and older country. For example, some of us from Macedonia was in Kosovo, someone was in Albania, and someone was, for Skopje in Tetovo because there wasn't the war.
Right.
It was very difficult time. The war here continued for 6 months, and it was something really bad, really bad. I was just 14 years in this time. 14 years, yes, 14, 15 years, and I lost my
Povedi šušljagve.
Kush.
Ti avansa.
I lost my school also, and some of the people died in these days, and these people was our neighbors, our family that we know because we are small city here, and it was something very bad.
There is a camp in Skopje with about 1,500 Roma refugees.
From Kosovo, yeah?
From Kosovo, exactly. They've been there in the camp for 15 years.
Yeah.
They're still in the camp.
Yeah.
There is no integration program.
No.
No.
So why would people be surprised when they say, well, the refugees don't want to stay here? Why would the refugees want to stay here?
Because here people from here don't have perspective here. For example, average of the salary here is around 200, 300. Also, most of the people aren't working, and how they can, for example, can take a job or like this. Also, here we don't have they cannot find here good condition for life. I'm sure for that, because we don't have enough space. For example, in our schools, we don't have here enough good treatment. For example, in the hospital, and this is some of the reasons why they cannot don't want to take asylum here, or don't want to stay here.
شالت كل واحد شايل شنطتين وزع تقريبا ما بيعادل مستحيل يعدل 100 بيجامه للاطفال في الاخير كل واحد
لا ما وزع بيجامه لا
مهل مثل هاي
ليك
يا دوب وقفوا سكروا الباب صار ازدحام بحجه الازدحام وعدم انتظام الصف رجعوا وقفوا وزعوا شوي وسكروا كل واحد شايل شنطتين
على السياره
ما في مكان اي واحد من اللاجئين اللي هون او المهاجرين ايش ما بدك تسميهم ما موجودين الا هاي المنطقه لمين ماخذ هو علنا بوضح النهار صارت هون صايره المشكله
مو بس هذا ولا بواط ولا شناتي بكل شيء
على بواط بس هي اليوم الصبح يعني اليوم كثير شافوها اليوم شافوها وخلص روح
اليوم في الساعة كم اليوم؟ أمس كان في الساعة 8 في الصباح
صباحا
اليوم كم؟
اليوم شيء الساعة 12
الظهر
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 ما اوكي الان انا اخبر ان شاء الله
ان شاء الله
ليه لا اذا غرضين 3 من الافانيك نحن عند البقاليه
هلا هنا انت عم بتقول انه هنا عم يمنعوا يدخلوا ممكن انه حدا يطلع وياخذهم منكم مثلا شغلات ثياب للاطفال او شغله او مساعده
نحن عم نطلع
ما فيش فايده منهم هؤلاء كفار ولا ثانية ما يشعرون
انا ما عم بقول له للاستاذ انه اعتقد هو نحن هلا عم نحلل انه انتم الشغله صارت لكم مفتعله هلا طلع اشاعه انه كانوا حطوكم مثل اليزي فانه صايره مفتعله من قبل بحيث انه صار الوضع انه هم بدهم يطلعوكم.
So that was the Tabanovce refugee camp near the border of Macedonia and Serbia. And I was speaking to Avni Sali, who himself was an Albanian refugee, as he described during his early years, his childhood. And he was and is still part of an organization, a grassroots organization that started by Albanian refugees in Macedonia to support the incoming refugees now. The organization is called Legis, and they sneaked me into the camp, into the refugee camp, which for all intents and purposes acted as a detention center rather than a refugee camp. And we spoke during the trip to that camp. The second part of my project was done in Palestine, and it was, so the first part was about the right to movement, the freedom of movement. The second part of the project was about the right to land, the right to stay. And for that, Palestine seemed to be just the right place where a lot of the issues come to fore. Rather than speaking about that, I would like to share another video with you, and then maybe we can, my presentation can end and we can start, talk. So bear with me again.
Can you talk a little bit about you?
Wrong, this one.
In 1948, when Israel was created on 78% of Palestine, the ceasefire line was basically down this valley. That ceasefire line is called the Green Line. And the Green Line is the line that continued to exist between 1948 to 1967. After that, Israel occupied this area. And of course, when Israel occupied this area, they started to build colonial settlements around this area. The colonial settlements include one of the largest in the Bethlehem region, is the Gush Etzion complex of settlements, which basically dot the hills. Behind this hill there's settlement. On the other side, another hill, there's a settlement. So this is basically the structure that has developed since 1967 on the 22% of Palestine that was not conquered in 1948, but was conquered in 1967. When we talk about the villages here, there's a village Al-Walaja and Malha and Lifta, and those villages in West Jerusalem, they were all ethnically cleansed in 1948. In the case of this particular village, Batir, they were lucky enough that the village stayed intact, and the reason for that was basically an act of resistance from the local people when a few young people led by Hassan Mustafa, who was the village council head, came back from the refugee camps and lit candles and lights in the houses to try and show the Zionists who were on that hill over there that this town has not been conquered and has not been emptied, and the people did not run. And they literally lit all the houses of the village, even though there were few of them, and they kept encouraging people to come back here. And they managed to keep this village since then. And this village has become UNESCO recognized World Heritage Site for several reasons. One is it's a unique village in the sense that there are very few Palestinian villages and towns that can claim to have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. Jericho is one of them, for example, 12,000 years of continuous inhabitation, from the Natufian agricultural development to the Canaanitic civilization, of course. Another town that was continuously inhabited for thousands of years is this town. Batir. The terracing of the hills and the water distribution system is unique and has been practiced as such for these thousands of years unaltered. So you see the terraces over there, some of these terraces are actually 5,000-6,000 years old. They go back to Canaanitic time. And this, we call it in Arabic al-mudarrajat. Down when you walk down the valley, you will see more of this terracing that is there. The other thing is the water distribution system. Now, the water distribution system here was based on the fact that Batir has 8 main families or large families, clans if you want. And so the Batir day is actually 8 days rather than 7 days, as I say. And the reason for that is they actually distribute the water to each family for 1 day, for 8 days, so and then the cycle repeats itself. So there is a pattern, you can see the farms down there, each one of them agricultural land, and the people of Batir divert the spring water, which the spring is here, we'll see it when we go down. So that distribution is kind of interesting and unique and has been going on for God knows how long, but at least hundreds of years. The other thing is that the civilizations that have come here and controlled this area, while they controlled the area, the people, as I mentioned, continued to live here. Actually, old Byzantine, Roman, Islamic, Canaanitic archaeological sites here in this town that are of high significance. So those 3 main reasons that justified us asking UNESCO to recognize Batir as a World Heritage Site and as such help us protect it, help the Palestinians protect it. Now, of course, we Palestinians also were very interested in this area also because it's threatened. Because the villages between the green line, between the ceasefire line down the valley and the wall that we passed by as we came here, this is called the seam zone, and Israel doesn't want Palestinians in this area. And 62% of the West Bank are those areas that Israel doesn't want Palestinians in and eventually wants to annex to Israel for the pure Jewish state of Israel. Today, as we speak, Palestinians have access to only 8.3% of historic Palestine. On this 8.3% of the land lives 6.2 million Palestinians today. The other 91.7% of the land is controlled and run for the benefit of 6.1 million Israeli Jews who are mostly new immigrants to this country in the past 7 decades. When I say 8.3%, that continues to shrink. So land from Hussein and Wadi Fukin have recently been confiscated just down south from us and down this valley there. And those are places that have been taken over, so eventually it'll shrink to nothing if the trend continues, and we hope it doesn't continue. With the resistance, of course, we slowed it down significantly, but still we have a lot of work to do. But eventually, I say I'm very optimistic. Historically, Palestine for 10,000-12,000 years have been inhabited by people of various religions and backgrounds. Conflict was less than 1% of our history over those 10,000-12,000 years. If you add them all up, the Crusaders, the Zionists, 130 years, etc. All of these ended up in failures. All of these attempts to make Palestine uniform, to make Palestine monolithic, if you want, make Palestine all Christian or all Jewish or all Muslim or whatever, have all failed. There was one Muslim ruler, by the way, who also tried it for about 30 years and failed. The Crusaders tried it 130 years, they failed. The Zionists tried it and they also failed. Past tense, not future tense. Between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean today, there are 6.2 million Palestinians, and that's thanks to our persistence and resistance here on this land.
نلاقيها ونحييها ويلك يلي تحادينا يا ويلك ويل بالله تصبوها القهوة وزيدوها هيل وزيدوها للنشا مع ظهور الخيل يلا صبوها القهوة وزيدوها هيل وزيدوها للنشا مع ظهور الخيل بحبوا ليك شوقي بحبوا ليك طبيبي داويني قلبي ملوع يا وعدي بدي طبيبي داويني دوا الطبيب ما ينفعني دوا الطبيب ما ينفعني شوفت حبيبي تشفيني يا عيني شوفت حبيبي تشفيني وحالي حالي حال ومالي مالي مال وحالي حالي حال ومالي مالي مال حالي حالي حال ومالي مالي مال وحالي حالي حال ومالي مالي مال وقدك الميال يا عمر يا حسين البال من يسر قدك الميال يا عمر
We are back. So just a little bit of information about that. That's Wadi al-Mahrur. It's an area, part of Area C, which is an area that is Palestinian land, but under control, military control of Israel, and the Israeli forces have regular incursions there. It's an area that is, in spite of its being very beautiful and quite close to Bethlehem, where the students study, it's not a very hospitable area because precisely because of the fact that Israeli forces can go there anytime. And the walk happened between the town of Batir and the village of Beit Jala, which is now part of the suburb of Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So should I start? Do you hear me, Gita?
Yes.
Thank you so much for beautiful journey and presentation, and also the powerful videos. Actually, I had some question about the methods of your work, and then what did you do, what happened. So then I just got my answer through your videos and your presentation. So I tried to skip off some of the questions that I had before. And maybe just one or two questions that I have, it would be, for example, I would like to ask you, since I myself work at the Museum of Movement in Sweden and directly work with oral history, I found points of contact in Declaration Part 1 and 2 when reading about and looking at the pictures at your website and now in your films. I especially think about the participatory intervention with the students of Dar al-Kalima University in Bentollah regarding the ancestors. Please tell us some more about the challenges that you encountered when working with the particular oral history method of recording the elders' forgotten memories.
Yes. What you do not see in the video that I just showed is the what was part of the walk, and I could not bring it into the video because I do not have direct permission for it. It is as we were walking, we were also playing back stories that the students had recorded in conversation with their parents or grandparents. When I went to Bethlehem, I was there as an artist in residence on the invitation of the Kalama University, University of Art in Bethlehem. And I worked with the students for 4 weeks. We had workshops, regular workshops, during which we explored this notion of connection to the land. Now, connection to the land, aside from that ideological issue, has a really very material, very practical dimension. For most Palestinians who are now either in refugee camps or displaced from their original hometowns, those connections are broken and fragmented, even though the general collection, ideological connection to the land, to Palestine remains. The specific connections to birthplaces, to places where their ancestors are from, are broken. In addition to that, because Palestine towns are really congested, these are very dense urban centers with very little green space. And because of the checkpoints, because of Israeli checkpoints, many Palestinians who live in towns, in the cities, really rarely get the chance to explore the country, to explore the agricultural land, unless they have families and they can go visit a family. And for that, you know, often they have to go through Israeli checkpoints. So So for me, the question was whether I wanted the students to explore their own connection to the land. Now, this area, Al-Makhrur, is very close to where they study. And although from time to time they sneak in there and, use the beautiful scenery as a backdrop for, video shoots or photograph shoots, they really do not spend a whole lot of time, because that's not a very welcoming space, precisely because it is constantly under the threat of Israeli, not invasion, but Israeli incursions into the land. On top of that, the area is dominated by one of the largest Israeli settlements, illegal Israeli settlements. Not that the settlements, any of them are legal, in fact, but this is even further illegal. The settlement of Hargilo, which dominates that area of, dominates Jerusalem and dominates Al-Makhrur, this Wadi Al-Makhrur, this beautiful, huge terraced agricultural land that has been in use for thousands of years. So when we started working with this, what is our connection to the land beyond the ideological issues, we had to explore both our own memories, and I had to ask them to explore their own memories. And because their memories really do not go very far back, they had to go and speak to their parents and grandparents. So the project became, took on this oral history dimension as well. And it was in that conversation with their parents and grandparents, where the students learned about their own heritage, their own origin. Most of them are internally displaced people. They are Palestinian, they live in Palestine, but they are not from where they live. They come from places that were occupied either during 1948 or during 1967. And so exploring this connection to the land became the center of the work. So as we were walking, we were playing back the stories that the students had collected from their parents and grandparents. The other part of this was exploring what is traditional in, what is indigenous to Palestinians, what's traditional to Palestinian traditional connection to the land. Aside from farming and agriculture, there is also walking. Now, Palestinians used to walk from place to place. Raja Shahara writes about this, walk through Palestine. They used to walk from one village to another through these beautiful rolling hills. And walking was a matter of, it was a daily practice, walking through this land. And as you walk through the land, I hope the video was able to give you a little bit of the sense of what it feels like walking through this beautiful, kaleidoscopic kind of landscape, where you're surrounded by these, places that are remnants, memories of the land itself, these terraced hills. These terraces were built 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And so as you're walking, every stone has a memory. And as you're walking through the landscape, gives you that connection to the land itself. So it was bringing these two together, this oral history, as well as that very embodied memory of walking through the landscape, that became the core of the project.
I wanted to ask audience if they have any questions. So the discussion is open, and then they can ask any question that they have from Gita. Back to my another question. So maybe it's more about connected with your work, but more connected to future art project that you have. Gita, I remember that you mentioned that earlier about your exciting new art project that once again has collaboration methods as its base. The artistic project is about Zandokh Shirazi, an Iranian feminist poet and women's rights activist born in 1909 in Shiraz, Iran. Tell us more about this exciting art project and of course, when it's be showcased.
Thank you for asking. I've been working with Iranian history off and on through my projects through the many years that I've been working, and the past and I've worked with particularly with women's history in a number of projects. The Emergent project, the series of podcasts that you mentioned earlier, was also, I was talking to women who were born after World War II, who are the first generation of Iranian women who studied in large numbers and went to work in large numbers and really changed the face of Iran, changed the culture and changed social relations. But as it happens, history is written often by men, and so the dominant version of history leaves out women as social agents, as political agents. So my quest here is to look at women's agency. The project that I'm working on now, as I learned about the generation, the post-World War II generation, I learned that that generation inherited much from the earlier generation who came of age right after the constitutional revolution in Iran during one of the periods when there was openness and a quest for freedom and open conversations and discussions. This is before the Pahlavi monarchy established itself as yet another oppressive monarchy. So these are women, this earlier generation of women, in fact, had formed, there were radical feminists who were very connected to women's movement around the world, were very aware of the women's movement around the world, and also were very active in Iran. They were writing, they were, 10, 12 women's journals that were independently being published. Women had their own independent associations, and, they organized the plays and talks and lectures, and they had meetings. And all of this came to a halt as a result of the first Pahlavi Shah's oppressive policies, where basically all of the independent organizations, political organizations, were banned, and therefore women's activities, women's independent activities, was also undermined. So I wanted to go back to this generation. They're my grandmothers. And I came across this woman, Zandokh Shirazi, who was a radical. She's from my hometown, but I did not really know about her. She had gotten lost in the pages of history. And as I researched about her, I learned that I was amazed. Like, for the first year that I was reading about her and reading her work, I was in total shock. It's like, wow, this woman existed and I did not know, because I thought that it was the later generations. We, as it goes, maybe we learned feminism from elsewhere, from the West. Yet here I am discovering, a radical feminist in my hometown. And so the project is starting from there. And I'm working with her own writings, her own poems and articles and speeches, and putting them, remixing them in a text that is going to be delivered with by a group of 6 women as a collaborative project. And it will be done online, as everything else is these days. So I will have that information on my Facebook page later, and I can also forward it to you.
Thank you.
There is one question.
So there is one question that I'm waiting for it. We have a question. Thank you so much, Gita, for your presentation. You have raised so many important themes about home, wayfinding, belonging, and memory. You talked about human rights as practices rather than documents. Is walking one of these practices? And are these more practices you are exploring?
Walking, of course, if I understand the question correctly, whether walking is a practice that connects us to, I guess, rights, I would say yes. In fact, even if we look at the way our lives are structured these days because of COVID-19, really, there are places that we cannot go, you know, and if we go to some places, we have to be, you know, we have to wear masks, or, you know, so our lives are regulated. Our connection to the land itself is regulated. So I would say that yes, in fact, walking through the landscape is a form of connecting, is a form of claiming that connection to the land. And I think that connection to the land is a birthright. It's a natural right of all humans.
Thank you. No more questions. So thank you so much, Gita. There is no more question, and our time is over. Thank you so much for participating and discussing Declarations 1 and 2 with MME at the Museum of Movement in Sweden. I wish to thank you, our global viewers online, and I wish you all a good afternoon and good evening.
Thank you, Parveen.
Thank you.